Hi, thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Kirti Ranchod. I am a neurologist focusing on how to keep the brain healthy in order to reduce the risk of certain illnesses such as depression, dementia, anxiety, or strokes. And from a practical perspective, I'm working on how to optimize certain core brain skills. Skills such as creativity, calm, or critical thinking. Skills that I think are essential for us to live better, love better, or lead better. The series of talks focuses on what we have within our traditions and our cultures, our ways of living, which support health, brain health, or healthy aging. Within this, do we have the tools to sleep better, to eat better, to think better? And with that, do we stay healthy? Do we enjoy the lives we have? Do we cope with the stresses? I am really honored to have as my guest speaker today, Professor Sylvia Vollenhoven. She is an award-winning playwright, filmmaker, and journalist. She's the founder of Vision in Africa and a professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. Her book, Keeper of the Kumm, is an inspiring account of her journey. And from a health perspective, almost a very practical manual on how to understand and accept self, on how to heal, and how to thrive. Welcome, Sylvia. I'm so happy and so excited to be hosting you to hear your insights on health and healthy aging and the impact of the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we've forgotten. So yes, let's start with that actually.
The stories we tell ourselves and the stories we've forgotten?
Yes.
That's a good place to start, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because I once listened to a man saying in, one of these ordinary workshops that one goes to in your professional life, and he was saying, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of the questions that you ask. And I thought about it for a long time. And then I realized you can add to that, it's determined by the quality of the stories you consume, the stories you believe, the stories that you tell yourself, and the stories or the narrative by which you live. And if you're living in the midst of a narrative that no longer serves you, unhappiness. If you're living in the midst of a narrative that is contrary to your very nature, but it's what everybody around you believes and tells you is the truth, or unhappiness. So I think for me, I've found the greatest happiness inside myself being guided by my own story, no matter what the cost.
I think just given personal and professional experience, I can see the challenges in terms of actually doing that. Like listening to that narrative, finding the one that resonates with you and taking the risk, because it is really risky to follow that narrative, isn't it? So what advice would you give all of us? Yes.
Well, I've realized a long time ago that I'd rather, ride my own story animal and fall from a very high place sometimes than climb on the back of somebody else's bandwagon and be really uncomfortable with the company that I keep. So the only advice I can give you is to not just intellectually understand that falling down and getting hurt and being damaged is part of the deal. It's the only way we learn as human beings. Unfortunately, we don't learn much during the happy times. And so as much as there have been times in my life where it's been really uncomfortable following my own star, but the end result has been so amazing, is so consistently amazing and leads me into such magical places that I can't even begin to think at this stage of my life that I'd want to live in any other way. But yes, to acknowledge the fact that there were times when it was scary, when I didn't know what I was doing, especially when I sat once in a room with 5 sangomas all doing one big sangoma ritual around an illness that I had. Scary and confusing and painful, physically painful, emotionally, mentally painful. But when you come out the other side, there's such a newness and a freshness and new exciting possibilities that open up that it is invariably worth it.
When I read your story, it's an excellent, excellent book. I've got a page full of quotes, actually. Your life was dynamic, exciting, full of risk, but still got you to the point where you needed to do something different.
Well, I suppose, yes. From a very young age, I seem to have made some great choices, especially around my career, and had an amazing career as a journalist right from the 70s, when South Africa was taking the first tentative steps towards ending apartheid in the mid-70s, and that's when I became a journalist. So it's been a magical life. And I suppose what happened for me is that I grew up in a household where there was a mixture of influences. My grandmother was a really traditional Khoikhoi woman, but embraced a rather fundamentalist Christian religion at the same time. And she did that kind of balancing act. But my grandma and my mom were very, very strict in their parenting. And so there were a lot of don'ts. You couldn't go to bicycle, you couldn't wear lipstick, you couldn't wear jewelry, you couldn't dance, you couldn't go out and go to the same church. And so it was a very rigid upbringing, and that led to a huge rebellion for me as a young person. I had to break out of that because it was very suffocating. And, at one stage I became really depressed as a young person. That was part of it. And so breaking out of that and enjoying the fruits of that kind of rebellion and going into the media world, which was the polar opposite of what I'd been brought up with, opened up so many doors for me. But then I went completely the other way. I became completely reckless with my health, with my well-being, with my spiritual path, all of that, all of the spirituality that I'd been brought up with and that my grandmother so carefully nurtured just went out the window. I don't think I ever had the courage or the conviction to flirt with atheism, but I definitely questioned everything that I was brought up to believe in terms of my faith. And that was very necessary because finally that sort of lifestyle led to a complete collapse physically, mentally, spiritually, and where I had to acknowledge that the path that I was on had served me up to that point, but the time had come for a complete turnaround and not going back to my comfort zone of my youth and the kind of religiosity and the dogma that I'd been raised with, because that has never been comfortable for me, even as a young person. But discovering a personal, tailor-made spirituality that is deeply rooted in African custom and tradition, and that suits me, and that kind of led me out of some serious physical illness problems that I had some years ago. And when I look back, I realized that all of those turning points in my life, were preceded by excess of passion, living large, living well. I can't do it any other way. I've never been able to live safely. And I must say, sometimes when people who have read the book come up to me and they say, my God, what a life you've had. And I think, okay, I just kind of thought it was normal when it was to me. But I guess it's not your average kind of path. And some of us are chosen to do things that are out of the ordinary. And when we accept that, it's great.
So given this, the importance of faith and spirituality for health and for healthy aging, what do you think?
Oh, you know, it's a question that we can sit and talk about for the rest of the week. Okay. But to put it in a nutshell, the way I've come to see what this whole existence is that we are created in this magical way where you have this physical reality, our bodies, our surroundings, the plants, the trees, everything we live off, our friends and everything. There's a physical aspect of it, but that is like the tip of the trunk of a huge elephant in the way that it really is. Because when you start cleaning up your act and eating properly and drinking properly and keeping the right company and stop watching so much crap on television and reading the right books, you raise the level of your entire existence, and you open yourself up to seeing things as they are rather than as you were raised to see them. And when you do that, you see that the physical existence and the intellect and all of the tangible things around us is such a tiny part, and what's lurking behind it, the rest of the elephant, is massive, and that has a very different construct. You know, it's not so much individual entities operating individually. There is a huge complex existence that we are part of, and everything we do, everything we say, everything we think affects not just our physical bodies and our brains and our minds, but it affects everything and everybody around us. And so when we live with that awareness comes a kind of elevation of yourself and your existence, and with that elevation flows in different kinds of energy. So now everybody uses a range of energy that's available to us to live, to eat, to breathe. But the more you become more conscious and you live consciously, the kind of energy that you are drawing on is completely different. And that it's like rocket fuel. Now, instead of just traveling down the road to work every day, you can go to Mars and back if you like. And so you can see things that other people can't see, and you can experience things that other people can't experience. And the bottom line is that the amount of just pure joy and happiness and love that flows through your life, and the magic of how things happen and come together, is just a completely different existence, you know. And I just think I have been really blessed in one lifetime to experience living in a very cramped, closed, depressed, narrow, dark kind of way, fearful of things and nervous about things, and then experiencing that opening up of myself to live more fully in who I am and be more consciously connected with the world around me and the energy that I use and how I use it, and not thinking that I rule and I guide my life and I determine things. I cooperate in how my life pans out.
It sounds like a hard lesson to learn, actually, and to have the insight to actually have to acknowledge that. And again, reading your story, it was such a powerful book. I think it would resonate with so many people going through things differently. But often it seems like we're fighting with this life as opposed to trying to embrace it and, you know, find the journey that works for us going through it. Given our previous discussion as well, and this, I think what I was interested also in exploring was the impact of living well, which you mentioned, you know, this very cohesive way of actually living everything, what we watch, what we eat, who we associate with, and how then that impacts on us and our health. And both in terms of healing our trauma and celebrating what we have to celebrate in our lives, I think both are important if we are to age in a healthy way. So how do you think stories and storytelling help us with regard to that?
I think the way we are constructed as human beings, we understand great truths and huge complex issues by a story. It is extremely hard for us to understand knowledge in the abstract. When we are telling stories, when we are experiencing stories, in the presence of stories, knowledge is being imparted in a way that is really hard to pin down intellectually. But it's easy to see maybe at the level of children when we're telling a story about Little Red Riding Hood. It is a cautionary tale. It embeds in them an understanding of dangerous behavior and how to be safe when they're away out of the house and away from their parents. It's exactly the same with adults. When we pass on stories, there are several layers of the good ones, you know, and I suppose the damaging ones can also be very complex and layered. But the good stories that we tell, the ones that come from the root of our creativity, that comes from another place outside of the brain, those are stories that are passed on again and again in different ways, in different words, to pass on knowledge, to help us to live better, to help us to understand our connections, our cohesive connections and our social complexity. And it's all there. It's in the ancient myths and metaphors. It is in all the holy books that we follow. It is in our children's books, and it's in the stories that come to our modern day writers. It's the same stories coming to us again and again, a little bit better every time, because evolution is real, and every generation is more equipped to understand more of the complex reality of the universe. But story is the best way for us to get in small piecemeal fashion the huge complexity that our brains cannot cope with, and that is how we are conceived, created, and how the universe works.
I completely agree. And I can also see the power of stories in terms of helping us to process things that we have to go through. And so we will all relate to stories in a different way, the same way, you know, that we respond to music or we respond to art. There's a conversation that happens between you and whatever has been created that resonates with you. And from a practical perspective, so how can people incorporate this so that it leads them to health? Like, what do people need to do on a practical perspective? Is it just read more? Is it getting in touch with stories from their own cultures? Like, what does it actually take?
We're all trying to cross this river, right? And so there are various means available to us. I have found something that is very specific to me, and I suppose it's because of where I come from, but I'm extremely averse to evangelism, and I'm very cautious about especially the new age movements that every day there's something new. You must try this one and you must try that one, you must breathe in this way, you must do this kind of yoga. There is so much out there, but I do believe that the boat that you need to get across this river will come to you. Yes, searching is an important part of it. And so step one is to eat, drink, live properly. You know, just be conscious of what it takes to be a complete, healthy human being. And when you just make small concessions in your life, you just give up something, or you just start the meditation in the morning, things will come into your life that belongs there. When you're living in a certain way that mitigates against that flow of energy into your life, you are making all the decisions with your brain, and intellectually you're guiding your daily existence, and you're eating badly, and you're drinking badly, and you're smoking or whatever. And of course, you're not open to the best possible life that you can lead. So it starts with you giving up the things you know is really bad for you. And I'm not talking about being fanatic about things, you know. Occasionally I can allow myself a glass of wine, but as I get older, it becomes less and less enjoyable, I must say. But there are certain things that mitigate against hearing guidance that is beyond the brain, and we need that guidance to live fulfilled lives, to live conscious lives. And so when we change the physical existence and make those adjustments, these things will come flowing into our lives. So we don't really have to go out in search of this church or that movement or that thing on the internet. The search can be fun. Reading all those books, I had a library of spiritual books at one point, which I all gave away, not because I had suddenly found I disagreed with them, but because you move beyond that part of the search, you know. And what I now find is, if I live in a certain way, things come through to me very powerfully, and then I know instantly, that's the next thing. I have to try that particular health medicine, or I have to read that person's book, or I have to go and see that lecture or whatever. And it's just the stepping stone, the next step and the next step, because we never stop growing. And you can never say, I've got it, I've got the answer, I've now reached that level, you know.
Several questions from what you said. So one of the things that I am aware of is that there's a degree of insight and self-awareness that you have. So the first question is, how do you actually develop that? And the second question is, and this is, you know, from lots of different spheres, but particularly in my work environment, we often know what's harming us. We often know what's good for us, but we don't make the choice. Like, there's something about our behavior where we're unable to motivate ourselves to do what we know is good for us. Why do you think that actually happens?
Because we're not done with the thing yet. I struggled for a long time with the knowledge that I drink far too much,
right,
and that it is really, really bad for me physically, emotionally, you know, and it's limiting my progress. But I can't say that there was suddenly a day when I thought, that's it, I'm going to AA, I'm stopping at not another glass. When that lesson was finished, it was finished. It left, you know. But it didn't, for me, it didn't have anything to do with a regime around giving up drinking. And I don't want to sound as if I'm talking against things like the AA, for instance, because a lot of my friends and my family are members of the AA, and I have huge respect for it. But that just didn't work for me, because I couldn't sort of feel that being strict and deprivation was the answer. I needed to understand why the addiction was there and what would get me past it. And that was not an intellectual understanding. That was a matter of growth. So once I had facilitated my growth and made sure that I made adjustments in every area of my life, that particular problem with addiction just slowly disappeared.
right. And so we come back to it. It's a slow development of insight and self-awareness.
I think the development of insight and self-awareness for me probably started on one level, started with the fact that I love research, I love reading. And so I read so many fantastic books, and went to so many great lectures and met great gurus from here to India. And on that level, that really helped. That search was very fulfilling, very cleansing, and very cathartic. But on another level, I've always had amazing dreams ever since, you know, a young kid. I can remember very, very strongly. And the guardian spirits that I work with and my ancestors speak to me very powerfully in dreams via metaphor and story. And the dreams are always accompanied by things that happen in my real life. So I will dream something, and then a week later, or a day later, or maybe the very next day, something will happen, and I'll instantly see the connection between what I dreamed. For instance, the first time when I consulted a Sangoma, I didn't think about it much, but I had dreamt about his exact address and where he lived and how to get there and stuff. And only after I'd started consulting him, I went back to my journal. Keeping a journal is really very important for spiritual development. And I went back to my journal and saw, oh my God, I had that dream. The same with the book and the play that became the adaptation. I dreamt about those structures. So that's no longer your mind operating, or your brain operating rather. That is guidance coming from somewhere else. And so for me, especially in the last few years, the amazing spiritual development that I've gone through and that I've experienced has come not so much anymore via reading and listening to other people, but more going inside and paying much more attention to the guidance that I'm given in dreams and in the real things that happen every day.
So what I'm also hearing from what you're saying is there was a very active process in terms of being aware of the dreams, writing them down, but not sort of analyzing and thinking about it, but just understanding that this had some sort of significance. And this then developed as the years went on in terms of giving you the insights that you needed.
Exactly. You know, we are so ruined by popular understanding of these things, especially when you start talking about dreams and hearing voices and listening to spirit. People instantly go to the cheesy stuff that we see in popular mainstream storytelling. And it's nothing like that. It operates on a much higher level, so that the more I recorded and just set it down and just became aware, I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to like rack my brains and think, oh my God, you know, one thing I clearly understood is this is not about winning the lottery and dreaming numbers. Yeah, so forget about the lottery. And so all I have had to do is just set it down, just be aware. And sometimes it will make sense immediately. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for years.
I can see me being over analytical, actually. One of my favorite stories to share with everybody is the story of the artist Putuma Sioka. And I went to an exhibition at WAM on the Stars of the North, and he was one of the artists. And he was having these recurrent nightmares. So he went to see a traditional healer. And the traditional healer told him to sculpt to deal with the nightmares. And I thought, what beautiful, what profound advice, just to deal with whatever's happening subconsciously in a very tangible way, but not analytical, just tangible.
Exactly.
And a sculptor was
because
born.
Those things are connected. And you know, that really is the beauty of discovering that balance between your seen and your unseen world, is when you can pull through the guidance, the knowledge that you are getting on a daily basis, and you can connect it with the work you're doing, with the stuff I'm writing, with the plays, with the teaching. And when there's that seamless connection, the contentment and the peace is just beautiful, you know. And that's how we're all supposed to live, to have that cohesion between our worlds.
I think also the value of creativity in terms of health and well-being used in that setting, which was quite therapeutic when you think about it without being called therapy. And I know you use it in your work as well. What do you think the link is between creativity and well-being, and why is it important?
I think everything is creative, or rather all that we do should be creative.
I agree.
And so there's very little I do in my daily life that doesn't come from that creative side of myself, that isn't inspired or that isn't deeply connected to that creative side of myself. And that results in overall wealth and well-being and thriving. When it doesn't matter what pursuit you have, what job you have, what profession you have, when there isn't that connection between you as a creative being and as a spiritual being and the thing that you're doing, then you're not very happy. Then you're buying into that Cartesian fallacy of separation of the self and separation of individuals, and everybody is locked into these little boxes. And that's a very, very limiting, disabled way of living. So for me, everything is creative, you know, even when I'm cleaning the kitchen floor, it's creative. And when you truly work with that creative energy that sometimes gets so much, for me, I can't even open my car because the electricity is leaping off the car into my body. When you are so connected with that, the source of that energy and the amount that you can accommodate in your physical existence, then you understand that there's nothing that you do in your daily existence that is not creative.
I'm so glad you said that, actually, because a lot of people assume creativity is a very set, like you created a play or music or art, as opposed to the way you live. And because I think so too. I think when we cook or when we garden or, whatever it is, actually, it's such a creative process.
Well, our relationships with each other.
Our relationships with each other.
Creative, But, as human beings, we are so persuaded by the attraction of hierarchies and elitism. So we're always busy creating hierarchies and elitism. So I'm more spiritual than you. I can see things you can't. I can write plays you can't. And it's a very immature way of seeing existence. And at its worst, we create kings and queens and princes and all kinds of crap just so that we have something to look up to, when in reality, all we have to do is understand that each one of us is connected to such greatness within ourselves that we don't have to create physical entities to remind us of our potential, of how great we can be.
So it really is returning to ourselves.
Returning to the answers in ourselves, and also understanding that this physical world is a pale, pale reflection of what we are connected to. And everything here has a it's not that it's a complete reflection of our spiritual reality, but it has a connection to our spiritual world. So if I live in this kind of house here, this physical house reflects my spiritual reality. Right. If I have kinds of friends, my parents are these kinds of people, I also have spiritual entities that guide me, that have a parental role. If this is my physical family in this world, I have an ancestral family that I must consult and respect in the same way, and I have the same kind of depth of relationship that I have with my physical family. So when we get that and we do it, we don't just say, oh, I'm going to church on Sunday, or sit down once a month to burn some mpepu. When we get that, and we know that you're only happy if you really keep in touch with your mom and your siblings, and be involved with your nieces and nephews and be part of their life. It's exactly like that with your spiritual guardians and the spiritual entities that you work with. If you don't have cohesive, good relationships with all of that, then you fall down too easily.
Again, so nicely put in terms of for me to actually understand, because it's easy for us to think about our families and the relationships we need in this very material world, but we do often forget that there may be something beyond this, and then how to actually honor those relationships, actually, and whatever terms you use.
Yeah. And it's just simple. Before us, there were others, and we stand on the shoulders of all of those who've gone before. And when we acknowledge that, we can work with what the results, the heritage that they've left us. I work with that every day, whether I'm writing a play or teaching kids at the university. I have the advantage of that heritage that I can draw on. So you don't just draw on what people have given you without acknowledging them, without having a relationship, without saying thank you, without being appreciative. And the more you are appreciative and the more you say thank you, the more they give you. It's just how it works.
Yeah. You mentioned drawing on your heritage, and one of the things that does come across quite strongly in your book is the alienation from our stories and our myths and the impact that this has on us and on our health, particularly our mental health, our psychological health, and then how that leads to a whole host of physical symptoms as well. But yeah, just your thoughts on that. But also, as I was thinking about it, whether it's not just our alienation from our stories, it's an alienation from what we eat, how we think, how we relate to each other, and how that then all filters down to what, in essence, is a reflection of an unhealthy society now, right?
Exactly.
We have a multitude of problems.
We're so comfortable with talking about our family relationships, our friends, our collegial relationships. But the moment we venture out of the physical and say, but what about your other relationships? What about your ancestors? What about your spiritual guardians? What about your spiritual family? People are not comfortable. And that's only a recent thing in human history. It's only recently that we've been taught to be uncomfortable. And I think it's just a hangover from the Industrial Revolution. But that's another story. and so when we sort of look at, let's just say, look at the South African family, and you look at the communities that have really, really serious problems around addiction, around trauma, around violence. There is such a clear correlation for me between those communities where I grew up in the Cape Flats, where people largely labeled as colored live with a very, very clear history that has been completely obliterated. And the current trauma that those communities are going through, the pathologies that abound there that are not as intense as other communities where people are connected to proud Zulu histories and proud Xhosa histories and proud Italian and Indian and all kinds of other histories. And here is this one community where the trauma and the massacres and the eradication of self has been so great that every day we see the walking wounded children, adults among us on the streets of those neighborhoods. And so when I was researching the book, I thought, my God, so I grew up with this kind of chip on my shoulder about colored people drinking too much and being gangsters and doing this and that and being too violent. And even as a journalist, I'd never really delved into it too deeply because we have become so comfortable with telling stories that are just events. All we do is recount events. So we have a fantastic 1 hour film about gangsterism on the Cape Flats, but nowhere in that 1 hour film that cost us so much money does it say why. Where did it start? What does it go back to? And so the book helped me really to not just look at the research, but reflect very deeply on and speak to some people about the effect of denying people their role in history, taking away their story of who they are and their story about themselves, and then telling them that just the very name we're going to give you means absolutely nothing. So this person will be called Xhosa, and that is linked to a certain history and has a place on the landscape of South Africa. But this person is called colored, and that is linked to absolutely nothing, which gives you no claim to anything, to the land or to its history. And that's devastating enough. But the 21st century result of it is just incredible. And we see it every day. One of the more recent plays that I've written deals with the story of Kritoa, the 17th century slave girl who was taken into the household of Van Riebeeck. And when I did the research for that, it was just so devastating when you come across the evidence in the archives of where it all started, of how Van Riebeeck enslaved people to alcohol so that he could get better prices for things, about how he was plying people with tobacco so that they would give him things that he needed for his business and his aims. And so when you go back in history and you see the start of what is a 21st century problem, it helps you to understand the solution isn't building rehabs. The solution is telling people different stories about who they are.
So 2 questions from that. How do we do that? And how do we stop this becoming more of a bigger problem? Because I see it happening to our stories, you know, like you see this in terms of that loss, and on the other hand, the appropriation, and it gets repackaged to you in a very sterilized version, you know. So you see both happening. But I think on one hand, you do want to heal what has already happened, and then you want to prevent this from happening again.
I'm very excited because I work with a lot of young people. And like I was saying earlier, evolution is real. So for me, if I have to put my faith in the next generation, that makes me extremely optimistic. They are capable of a lot more, of seeing the world differently, of wanting to make a difference. I'm not saying that my generation and those that came after me didn't do anything, but there's been a kind of generational ennui in the world in the last years. And so what encouraged me is the younger people. And so in answer to what we can do, for me, my personal solution is telling a different story, writing books, writing plays, making films, because popular storytelling and mainstream storytelling has let us down. So we've got to counteract that. And yes, it might be small compared to Bollywood and Gollywood and Nollywood and all the other woods right now, but every mainstream movement started as an alternative movement. So what today is small and not making enough of an impact will soon become part of the mainstream. A very good example is Netflix. Just the other day, all the major stories on the world's television, or 80% of the major stories and series, came from a small part of the world. Now, in a very short time, that has changed because appetites have changed and business imperatives have changed. So telling a different story, but also making sure that we don't wait until the history books and the academics catch up with us, because that takes very, very long. So we've got to tell stories that with our art, with our music, with our plays, with our clothes, with our fashions, with everything, that says, the story you've been telling about me is not just untrue, it is a lie that is damaging, it is deeply damaging, and that is holding back not just me, but our entire society. So for all of us to move forward, we need to start telling different stories, and we need to start consuming different stories of who we are, so that we can stand tall, so that we can get past this generation after generation of social pathologies like addiction.
Agreed. And I think you're doing lots in the field. So yeah, your work really is quite inspiring, actually. Before we end, just your thoughts on what is healthy aging. What would this mean to you?
For me, it's just very personally where I am right now. I couldn't imagine doing anything differently. I wake up in the morning and I go for a walk or do some yoga and breathing and meditation and play some music before I even touch this horrible thing called a computer or turn on that cell phone. And sitting there and just experiencing what is available in the intangible world, listening to the birds and feeling in the morning, especially that morning energy that you can tap into, that flows through me. And sometimes it's so powerful that I find myself spontaneously giggling and laughing and thinking, oh, well, if somebody walked into this room right now, they'd probably have committed. But knowing that, making the decision every moment of every day to choose this energy and not that energy, to choose this plate of food and that glass of drink and not that one, and choose that friend and not that one. Every choice, every moment of the day leads in a different direction. And in the beginning, it's hard because when you change a habit, it is not really easy. And a wise person I met once said, when you really want to change a habit, do the new thing constantly for 90 days. And then it becomes, and it's true.
Okay.
I struggled with a really powerful breathing technique that I was doing at the time. And then I just did it straight for 90 days. Now it's part of my life. I can't exist without it. And so make those choices and just live consciously. And every time you make a really good choice, something better opens up. Your world just becomes more vivid, more filled with joy and passion, and your entire physical body follows those choices you make. And so whatever you decide on that deep spiritual level and in terms of lifestyle, you can change your very DNA this way. And I truly believe that.
Thank you. I think that's really wonderfully said. And I am going to try to get up a little bit earlier and listen to those birds.
Not so much the Hadidas, some morning things.
I actually do love Hadidas, I have to admit. Thank you very much for making the time and for sharing your insights. I really have enjoyed this. I think I could speak to you for hours. But yeah, I think you really have helped me, and I'm sure you're going to have helped a lot of my viewers in terms of how to actually access different ways to health and healing and thriving. As you said, it's not just about health, it's about really enjoying the lives we live.
Exactly. And it can be so magical. Take it from me. It is, I can't think of doing anything other than what I am doing every day. And it has made me supremely happy.
Excellent. Thank you again. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom, which will help all of us on this journey to live better and for better health. I hope all of you were as inspired as I was. I would highly recommend her book, The Keeper of the Kumm, which, as I mentioned in the start, really is a manual on the journey towards understanding and accepting self, and how that then facilitates health in a very integrated, cohesive way. Thank you all for joining us. Please share this talk with people who would benefit from it. Thank you.